there's a quote of Cary Grant. Cary Grant would walk around a set messing with stuff. There's a lot of downtime in a movie set. He'd slightly disarrange books in a bookcase. He'd put a couple of cigarettes in an ashtray. And they asked him why he did that, and he said 100 details add up to an impression. And I think that applies to my music, and it applies to my writing.
Hey, I'm Jon.
I'm Cory.
And this is The Passage,
the podcast where authors break down their favorite pieces of writing,
taking you behind the scenes from the first spark of inspiration
to the final edits and everything in between.
Sometime last year, I became completely obsessed with the music of Beethoven. I discovered classical music relatively late, only in my mid-30s, but quickly fell down the rabbit hole, trying to cram half a lifetime of listening in as little time as possible. I was excited by this quote-unquote discovery and all the great composers and music that came with it, but it wasn't until I started paying attention to Beethoven's late piano sonatas that my interest turned into a full-on obsession. There were moments in those pieces that I would listen to over and over, passages that struck me as too astonishing to believe they could have been written 200 plus years ago. I kept thinking, what is this? What is this music? And I'd listen again, but the more I'd listen, the stranger the music got. It seemed to deepen, to grow more singular, to reach further into the future. Visionary was the word that kept coming to my mind. So in wanting to understand the music, I figured I would try to understand the man who wrote it. And that's what led me to Beethoven, Anguish and Triumph by our guest today, Jan Swafford. Reading it, I was struck not only by the extraordinary arc of Beethoven's life, its hardships and creative highs, but also by the remarkable achievement of the book itself. Beethoven died on this very day, March 26th, 200 years ago, almost 200, 199 years ago. And yet in Swafford's pages, his life feels vivid, immediate, not godlike at all, but strangely human. When I finished, I could say I felt a bit closer to the man and to the music, though much of the mystery of how Beethoven wrote remains. I also had a lot of questions for the author about how one writes such a monumental biography, especially when its subject is long gone and when so much has already been said about him, about the research process and about the responsibilities of a biographer. Luckily, he's here with us today. Jan Swafford is a composer and author of biographies of Ives, Brahms, Beethoven, and Mozart. He's an award-winning essayist and a longtime program writer for the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Jan, it is a real pleasure to have you on our show.
Thanks, Jon. Well, that was a wonderful introduction to Beethoven, but I'm going to start with Charles Ives.
Perfect.
And I figured
there was a risk, but it was one I was willing to take.
Well, I think we'll work over it. We'll work to Beethoven, which will be sort of in order because I want to talk about beginnings and endings of books. And here's the beginning of the Charles Ives book. In the old Ives house in the middle of Danbury, Connecticut, in 1874, among the warren of rooms smelling of beeswax and fruit, these sounds were familiar. The intimate patter of rain, the measureless pealing of thunder, the jingle of sleighs in winter, the shirr of spring peepers from springs and ponds, the clatter and clop of buggies down dusty Main Street, and the deeper rolling rumble of wagons on their way to shops and factories. From the Congregational church next door, the muffled sounds of choir and organ and the great bronze booming of the bell, and all day Sunday the sound of distant bells like intimations of a presence beyond the horizon of this moment, of this life. At holidays, the brass bands marching past, the rattle and crump of fireworks, the clang of the fire bell. In summer, the cries of icemen and boys selling newspapers. Inside the house, the groaning of old floors, the antiphonal voices of a big family's comings and goings. And every night, the bright rising and falling of music, cornet or piano or violin or bands, or little orchestras playing in the parlor or outside in the shed or in the barn, playing quick steps and hymns and Beethoven and Stephen Foster. On October 20th, 1874, from the large bedroom over the south parlor, rose the keening wail of newborn Charles Edward Ives, who would register the myriad sounds of home as few people have, and who would never forget them in the intimacies of their timbres and in their deeper human resonances.
You set such a scene immediately, Jan. How did you decide that that's how the Ives biography was going to start?
I didn't. Every writer you're going to talk to, and me most of the time, are going to tell you that, it's really very hard and things take a long time to develop. And it's the old idea that you leap out of bed with a great idea and write it down and it's almost there immediately. That just never happens. Well, in fact, that's exactly what happened with this beginning. I literally did leap out of bed and just write it flat out. But here's why. I really don't remember where I was in the book. I'm not sure I'd started the book yet. As such, I may have still been working on the research. How do you want to begin a book? You want to begin a book with something essential about your subject. You can always begin with them getting born, which is pretty essential, and in a way, I did that with Beethoven. But with Ives, what you want to talk about up front is his context, where he came from, because everything in his music had to do with where he came from, which was Danbury, Connecticut. And the themes that I set out there, even though I wasn't planning on them at the time, are really going to be developed through the whole book. And there's also a matter of setting the place in a visual way. There's a great lesson in a passage I read, I've never forgotten, in Vladimir Nabokov, his memoir. He was talking about a writer that he used to admire when he was young and now finds kind of stodgy and static. And he quotes a description this guy wrote of a castle. And he said the castle is just sitting there. At least he could have put a swift above it, a swift being a bird, because a castle with a bird hovering above it is a much more alive castle than a castle that's just sitting there. And there's a great lesson in that. And when I started this chapter, this page, I remembered that somebody had said that the Ives house always smelled of beeswax and apples. And meanwhile, I know about old houses in Vermont, for example, that do tend to smell of apples because from years of people keeping apples in the basement in the winter. And that is a way of bringing something alive that I did instinctively in this case. Does all my writing go like this? Not really as such.
Was the Ives book the first big biography you had written?
Yeah.
And you don't remember where that passage was in the process of writing? Was it at the beginning? Was it at the end?
It was the beginning, definitely, but I'm not sure I was working on the book yet. It may have been just an idea that hit me. That happens. It happens to everybody. Something hits you, and there it is.
But you start with all of these like auditory details, really more than visual or anything like that, and that to me seems so obvious for a biography about a composer, but I bet it's not the case in every biography of a composer. It just seems to work really, really well.
It's not only that, most of the sounds are thematic. Because one of Ives's earliest memories, they lived next door to a church. And one of Ives's earliest memories was of his father standing out in the rain, listening to the church bell next door and running in and trying to play the sound of that bell on the piano. And realizing that he needed notes in between the keys of the piano, he started filling with quarter tones after that. So this was absolutely a formative experience for Ives, that church bell. And Ives wrote bell chords for the rest of his life, chords that sound like bells. And this sense of distant bells is very important in his music. And all these things are going to be not just images, but themes in the book and themes about his music. Well, I didn't know this yet. But my intuition was telling me this is what you need to do. And as an artist, a writer of any kind, I'm mainly a composer, you realize.
Yeah.
You have to trust your instinct. If you don't trust your instinct, you're dead. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to give you good stuff.
Right.
Well, let me quote one of my favorite of all quotes. I'm going to paraphrase here for general audiences. Somebody asked Hemingway, what every writer needs above all. And he said a built-in shockproof crap detector. And I remember when I read that, I said, how dumb is that? I mean, I can't believe he said that. And then I realized, as one often does, that this was extremely, to know what is good and what's crap in your own work is one of the things that is absolutely necessary for an artist.
Yeah.
And the trouble is that nobody's crap detector is perfect, as Hemingway would have known as well as anybody, except maybe Mozart's.
Do you think like, okay, this is actually pretty good? Or do you second guess a lot of it?
I'd never questioned this page. I think it's probably the best page I ever wrote to this day.
Really?
I think so, yeah.
Wow, interesting.
Quite possibly.
Did you know it when you wrote it?
I wouldn't say that. I just said, well, I'll give you another example from another writer, Robert Frost. He was sitting, he said, at a table. He actually was lying a little bit, but it probably was sort of happened like this. He said, I was working on a poem at the kitchen table in Vermont. Well, it's called New Hampshire. It was the beginning of one of his books. I think maybe the book is called New Hampshire. It's a long, kind of very wry poem. And he said he worked all night on it. At the end of the night, he looked up and there was dawn coming up out of the window. And he got up and looked out and came back and wrote out, stopping by the woods on a snowy evening. And he said,
Wow.
I wrote it straight out and looked at it and said, this is my immortality. Well, it's not really true. There is a manuscript of the poem, and he did have to rework it some, but still.
It's a good story.
I didn't say this was my immortality, but I said this page is pretty good. I like this.
And if you're writing it at the beginning of the project, that must give you some momentum to carry you forward because, as I'm sure we'll talk about, these are complicated, long processes.
Well, now we get into something interesting. I think I'm glad you mentioned that. So I started writing. And when you write books about that are based on research, a lot of what you're reading is academic writing, which, let's face it, doesn't tend to be particularly poetic and lyrical and writerly. And meanwhile, I wanted to write an Ivesian book about Ives, just the way I wanted to write a Brahmsian book about Brahms, a Beethovenian book about Beethoven. In other words, the approach and the style of the book have to do with the subject and the personality and the work of the subject. So the Ives book, at some point, it's going to have imaginary sections. It's going to have extensive endnotes. It's going to have, and I'm going to put in the endnotes anything I want to that seems relevant. But I was going along and I was saying to a novelist friend of mine who was reading the book as I wrote it, and she doesn't know anything about music. Well, technically she doesn't. She's not a musician. I said, I find the writing kind of dry because I've been reading all this academic stuff and it's gotten into the prose, and I wrote this great first page, and she said, write the book the way you're writing the endnotes. Because the endnotes in the beginning were looser.
Yeah.
And more kind of off the cuff and sometimes. And that was the key to the style of the book.
Wow, what a great piece of advice.
Yeah.
Was it a coincidence, Jan, that you had a novelist as a first reader?
Well, she just happens to be a friend of mine who's a novelist, and we've been reading each other's stuff for years.
But she probably would have had a different perspective than if you'd given it to someone who wrote academic nonfiction.
That is absolutely right, and that's why I gave it. Well, we would have anyway, but that's why I trusted her to give me novelistic and creative input rather than technical input.
What was your experience as a writer before you had worked on the Ives book? Had you done this kind of storytelling type writing?
No, I'm telling music, I've talent as a writer. What I didn't have was taste. So in high school, I would write these gushy things, very much influenced by James Agee's prose and Let Us Play His Now Praise Famous Melodies. Agee's from Tennessee. I'm from Tennessee. He was sort of a hero of mine.
Okay.
And I would write these very gushy things that were just awful. But I got a job as the music writer for this short-lived but very interesting magazine called New England Monthly, run by Daniel Okrent. He wanted to create a kind of New Yorker of New England, and I was his music writer. But I didn't write that many features, really very little, because he decided that I wasn't a real journalist, and he wanted somebody who had a real journalistic sensibility, and he felt that I didn't. But what I did for 5 years was every month to write about 20 short pieces of 100 or so words about upcoming concerts, classical concerts all over New England. And it was an absolutely grueling thing to do because in 100 words, you had to get across performers and pieces and be interesting and evocative. And it was almost like writing poetry.
Yeah.
I mean, I faked an awfully lot of it. I mean, I would talk about performers I'd never heard of and so forth, but that's really where I learned to write. It was like writing 20 little poems every month for 5 years. There was an editor at New England Monthly called Dick Todd, and this is relevant because he was Tracy Kidder's editor, and Tracy Kidder just died. And so Dick Todd shepherded Tracy Kidder's books. I can't remember if it was his idea or mine, but just sort of between us, we came up out of this article. What about proposing a biography of Ives? And I was very excited to do that. I felt nobody had properly understood Ives. Nobody had really understood him and his music, I felt, at least on the page, very well. And I felt it was a book that really needed to be written. And I was the person to write it because Ives had been a hero of mine since I was a teenager. I wrote my thesis about him at Harvard. And I to this day, feel that I was born to write this book. This book needed to be written, and I was the person to do it. It's the one that's closest to me.
And how do you go from 100-word concert blurbs to hundreds of page biographies?
I probably shouldn't talk about it. There's a whole chapter of my writing life that I haven't mentioned yet, that is my hack writing life. When I didn't have a teaching job, I got these jobs writing hack history under assumed names, which I'm not going to tell you.
Like work for hire or things like that?
Oh, yeah. At one point, I had a choice of writing a book called Great History of U.S. Cavalry or a book called Cats, Cats, Cats. Which one do you want? And these books there's a guy who owned a whole lot of photographs of the Civil War and American wars, and he would hire people like unknowns like me for a nickel and eventually a dime a word to write history. I mean, the stuff to go around his pictures. And that's really where I tightened up my writing, and I learned to do research. As my boss at the time said, look, in this kind of writing, stealing from one person is plagiarism, stealing from two is research. But I would have 10 or 20 sources, especially I read a lot about the Civil War. And I started reading Bruce Catton, and I learned to look at a source. This was invaluable, really, and say, what is this going to do for me? When I first got this job, I was writing about the Civil War. I called a writer friend of mine who actually got me the job. And I said, I don't know anything about the Civil War, but who won? So you know what I did? I went to the World Book Encyclopedia, Children's Encyclopedia. But the Children's Encyclopedia book was written by a distinguished military historian. And there I got a sense of the whole Civil War in prose that was written for, 14-year-olds. And then I went to the Encyclopedia Britannica, which gave me a much bigger and more adult picture of the whole war. By then I knew the major characters. And then I began to dive into, meanwhile, we were partly ripping off some, academic writing about the war, but I went to Bruce Catton, who gave you the soldier's perspective of the war. I read a book called The Face of War, which is what a soldiers see. So between writing these little blurby things and the hack history, I wrote about 7 or 8 of these books. I learned to research, and I learned to write long form, and I learned to bring things alive, and to look for the telling detail, and all these things you learn.
What would your writing process have looked like back in the mid-90s?
Well, when you get a contract for a biography, what does everybody ask you right away? What's your angle? What are you going to say? It's brand new and radical. And my answer that I learned in the Ives is this. I knew a lot. I was an Ivesian when I started the book. I knew a lot about Ives. I'd read most of the available literature, which wasn't very much. I'd studied the music. I sort of knew how he put pieces together. I knew a lot about him personally. And I discovered in the process of doing the research that every single thing I thought I knew about Ives was either wrong or incomplete or irrelevant. And the good ideas came out of research. So from that point, when I got a contract, I said, I'm going to do everything I can to wipe out of my mind everything I think I know about Beethoven or Mozart or Brahms and start over from scratch. And the idea of saying, here's going to be my great idea when you haven't written the book or done the research yet, I think is absolutely wrong and artificial. The other thing is, well, what's your interpretation? And my answer is, I don't like to interpret people. I don't believe in it. I don't think I've said this before on podcasts. Nobody lives their life in order to be interpreted by somebody else in order to make money or get tenure. And I don't believe in trying to interpret people. I just believe in presenting facts. To me, a biography is a collection of facts. And the things that may seem like interpretations are things that are just obvious. You know, I make a point that Brahms was a very private man. Well, it's just obvious. That Beethoven was capricious and had a huge temper and so forth. It's not really an interpretation. It's just there in the facts. And to make facts speak is what I'm trying to do. But here's the thing. Emotions are facts too. Emotions are facts too. So when I write that Brahms, when his mother died, he was terribly upset, I didn't have a source for that. I just knew that he loved his mother. When your mother dies, you're upset. You just have to be a human being to know that. You bring your human sensibility and your human understanding to the books. But I do not want to put an interpretation on them. They tell me who they are.
Jan, you say that you stay away from interpretation. Have you ever been tempted to interpret when you're sitting down? Do you ever have an idea and you're like, no, that's a leap too far?
I do speculate sometimes, but I say so. Simple as that.
You must find it difficult at a certain point dealing with someone who has been dead for so long, where there are spotty records, where it's hard as you are working on a narrative. You've got this sort of gap and you don't really know what happens and there's no primary source or there's no real reliable book. What do you do there?
That's my subject. It's not so much true. Beethoven was the first composer who was really, people wrote down what he said a lot. I'll tell you my two things in my beginning of my process. The first thing I do is to type up a chronology. And with Beethoven, these are existing chronologies. There wasn't an Ives. I had to. And then after that, when I'm taking notes, every single thing that has a date in it goes into the chronology, whatever it may be. And often when you get things from different sources coming together in time in your chronology, you discover things. You find Brahms writing this strange letter to Clara Schumann that's not like him, you know, a list of reasons why she should come and visit him. He doesn't do things like that. Well, at the end he says, and bring your daughter. And you put that together in time and you realize that's when he was in love with Clara's daughter. So I get a chronology and then I type up letters. I look at every single extant letter. And I don't type up every word of every one of them. I type up sometimes hundreds of pages of letters. And that's when you really learn how somebody thinks. And you have to learn what people are talking about.
Was that your process from the very beginning? Did you know intuitively this is just how I am going to compile and get started? Did you hear it from anyone?
No.
Would it just seem to make common sense?
It's just common sense.
Do you still do it?
Well, I'm not writing biographies anymore, but if I were, I would. In a chronology, you learn when things happen, and you learn, you know, obviously. In letters, you learn as much as possible who they are. And you have to learn how they talk.
What's the fun part of writing these books? What's the most exciting part?
Two things are fun, I think. The research is fun. Research, if you're really interested in the subject, of course I am. I'm writing about people who fascinate me and whose work I love. You know, for example, I thought about writing a biography of Wagner after I'd finished Beethoven. I just said, no, I couldn't live with that guy for years. I just couldn't do it. I admire his music greatly on the whole, but I couldn't live with him. So the research mostly is fun, even though a lot of it is dry and academic. It's still, you're learning things that you didn't know, and you're learning more about your subject, and that's great. The other thing is the revision process, I think. The fun part of writing is after the first draft. The first draft is hard because you're getting ideas down for the first time. And after that, the revision process with me is generally kind of fun and smooth because it's not a matter of me sitting and screaming and tearing my hair about, pounding out every paragraph. It's just reading it over and over and over. And every reading, I make a few discoveries and a few changes, and then I put it aside and come back to it. So I'm a quick writer and a slow reviser. It takes me longer to revise, but that's kind of fun.
Are you doing a lot of writing in that revision process?
Small changes over time. There's a quote of Cary Grant. Cary Grant would walk around a set messing with stuff. There's a lot of downtime in a movie set. He'd slightly disarrange books in a bookcase. He'd put a couple of cigarettes in an ashtray. And they asked him why he did that, and he said 100 details add up to an impression. And I think that applies to my music, and it applies to my writing. It's getting these details by simply going over and over. Here's something else, by the way, I think every writer should understand. I'm quite convinced of this, and I think there's some science behind it now. I wrote an article for Slate about this. You see differently on screen and on paper. You just do. And you see better and deeper on paper than you do on screen. I was working on a book, Vintage Guide to Classical Music, which was sort of in the middle of the Ives and gave me some good experience. And I'd always written first drafts by hand, and I was religious about that. I want the first draft to be handwriting. But with that book, because I had to get back to the Ives, I just said, I started that way, and I said, I don't have time. I'm going to have to start doing first drafts on the computer because it's faster. And I realized to my chagrin, literally, that the first drafts are better on the computer than the handwritten.
Why do you think? Just a faster connection?
I don't know. I really don't know. But I also discovered something. Well, I already knew this. You do a draft on computer, you edit it, you get it as finely edited as you can, you print it out on paper, I double space it, print it out, and you realize then that it's crap. It's no good, and you don't know that till you see it on paper. I write a draft, I edit it on computer, I double space it, I print it out and carefully go over it. I read it through. It's a real process. I read it all through, and then I go paragraph by paragraph, reading each paragraph twice. And about 90% of the work that I get done is on that reading of each paragraph twice. And then I run it through I put the changes in the computer, read it on the computer again, print it out, single space, and go through the same thing all the way, paragraph by paragraph.
What are you looking for? What kind of changes are you making?
Bad stuff. Crapola, just...
Jan, I want to hear about how this applies to what you were talking about earlier, the hardest piece that you've ever had to write. Can you read a little bit from that Beethoven book?
In a way, it's a centerpiece of the book. It's a piece on the Third Symphony, which was a piece that anybody who knows anything about Beethoven knows that this is one of the most shattering, revolutionary pieces ever written. So what I was doing in the chapter that made it so hard, and the hardest thing I've ever done, took 2 months. I worked on this and at times I was so confused that I've never felt this way as a writer about what I was doing, that I just felt like I couldn't figure out what I was trying to, because I'm describing the process of composition and the finished piece at the same time, sometimes in the same paragraph. And it's just a very difficult thing to do. All right, here's a little bit of something. The dots and quilled and penciled on the page define an accumulating and clarifying vision of the work. Beethoven has never seen a battle, but years before, on the road from Bonn to Vienna, he encountered armies, heard the bustle and rattle of troops on the march, the bugle calls and martial music. The overarching conception and the minutiae of melody and rhythm and harmony feed on one another. As usual, he conceives his ideas in terms of familiar formal outlines. So now I'm talking about the process and the finished at the same time. For the first movement, he needs a thema for the opening, then what he calls the Mittelgedanke, subsidiary ideas. Then he needs ideas for the Durchführung, his term for the development section. What we call sonata form, and the sections of it hadn't been named yet, but he had named his own names for them. It's not like it wasn't around yet. His forms are not molds to be filled with notes, but general guidelines to help organize the conception. This time, the conception is a name, Bonaparte. Whatever the form becomes, it has to be measured and cut to that subject. He wears out one quill pen after another, notes spreading over empty staves, pages accumulating in the sketchbook. The conception will not be complete in his mind, not completely grasped, until the end is in place, or at least in sight. But as usual, by the time sketches are seriously underway, he already has a sense of what the thing is about, what the leading ideas are, a plan for where das Thema is headed and why.
Hearing you read it, you'd never know that that was a particularly labored over passage. It reads so smoothly. To me, how does it read to you, knowing the sort of back history? Are you happy with where it ended up?
Oh, yeah. I just kept saying to myself, I'm not going to unscramble this. It's scrambled. And I just have to unscramble it. I have to separate the two strands of finished piece and process of composition and keep
did you
them
know when you've
straight
done
for
it?
the reader. Oh, yeah.
But the present tense is an interesting choice there.
Yeah, I wanted you to feel like you're there.
Yeah. It works really well.
And that's why I always talk about the pen. I want people to see the pen in hand, and that piece is written one note at a time.
Yeah.
It's not like every note has to be thought about all in itself, but it's still written one note at a time.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, we love to do a quick round of rapid fire questions.
Jan, what's one aspect of writing that you think you're particularly good at?
Clarity.
What's one aspect of writing you think you're bad at?
Descriptions of things like landscape and visual descriptions. I always feel a block when I try to do that.
What's the first thing you edit out of a draft?
Every single word I don't need.
What's harder, finishing a musical work or finishing a book?
Music by a factor of 10.
Which composer is still waiting for the biography they deserve?
I would like to say Wagner in a way, one that is not a mere condemnation. I mean, Wagner was a hell of a piece of work. Wagner was not an ordinary egomaniac. I'm not sure anybody's really caught him exactly the right balance. But anyway, it won't be me.
Jan, is there a descriptive word that you tend to overuse when you write about music?
I think I've learned not to. I think, what was the word that in the Ives book my editor said? No, maybe it was in the Vintage Guide. I think it was magnificent or something like that. She said, you really should find another word here. But I think I've learned to avoid my favorite words. I got stuck on vertiginous for a while. I got that from Jorge Luis Borges. I had too many vertiginous things.
This is one we ask a lot of authors, but I'm especially curious about your answer. What do you listen to in the background when you're writing, if anything at all?
Writing, no.
No,
silence. I can't listen to anything. If I'm doing busy work of some kind, like copying music, yeah, and I like most kinds. There are very few kinds of music I just don't like. Right? So I'm listening to, I've been listening to 50s jazz, Balinese gamelan, Billie Holiday, Creedence Clearwater, Louis Armstrong. It's all over the place. I just love most music.
Jan, our last question, do you have a go-to procrastination method?
Screwing around on the internet, like everybody else.
A man after my own heart.
Doom scrolling.
Yeah. Jan, it was such a pleasure to talk to you today. Thanks for taking all the time to go through this with us.
Oh, this is great fun. I really liked it. I appreciate your doing this and your angle and your approach. And I think writers talking about writing is a good way to go.